Formalist criticism, new criticism. In the following presentation, we will observe an understanding of the literary critical approach known as formalist criticism and its sub-branch known as new criticism. So to begin, I'd like to begin with I guess you can call it a foundational understanding of the formalist approach, which is there's several branches. There's new criticism, and then the sub branches in response to this formalist idea, structuralism, deconstruction, which we'll observe in other presentations. But when we observe um, this new critical account, or any of these accounts actually, I like to begin with a foundational, right? A foundation of these literary attributes under the formalist umbrella. And to understand these, I like to begin with Plato. Now, Plato isn't directly addressing the issue of literature, but he is criticizing a group of individuals known as the poets. Now, when you think of the poets, don't regard them as the poets that we understand them in the contemporary sense, right? The sense of particular an author's use of stanzas or haiku, or lines or rhymes or meters. Although those will be in essence considered in the formalist account, but it's not what Plato's. It's not the understanding of poets that Plato's addressing. Instead, think of writers that are writers like Homer or Aristophanes, Sophocles, uh, um, who we observed, writings of Antigone and Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex. Well, the reason he disagrees with these writers, with these poets, with these composers, with these artists, so to speak, is that he categorizes them alongside a group of individuals known as the Sophists. So the Sophists are known as traveling professors. Now, these itinerary, right, these temporary professors, what they do is their sense of job and employment. They go around, they seek a household, and the household looks to hire them and provide instruction for them. And Now it could be that the household, wherever it is the sophists are looking to be hired, it might be that the household has a particular cultural um, perception. Right? They have a certain cultural values circulating within the household. Now, the sophist might discover that this cultural um, um, these cultural values, that they're erroneous, or maybe that they know of other truths that would be critical to these cultural values. Well, what the sophists would do is they modify their sense of the truth in order to preserve those cultural values. And that doesn't sound too bad, but in comparing it to what Socrates would say, now I mentioned Socrates. Socrates was Plato's teacher. Socrates was also criticized as a sophist, but uh, the argument, Plato's argument of why Socrates was not a sophist was because Socrates would instead directly tell the family household and say, look, your cultural values are wrong. And let me show you why they're, or let me question you, and let's dialogue and get you to understand why they're wrong. Now, I'm not going to claim to demonstrate a truthful cultural value. One of Socrates' famous quotes was, all I know is that I know nothing. But Socrates would, in essence, tell the family, tell the household, and say, look, this is wrong. And, sorry, but I'm seeking the truth. Well, he probably wouldn't get hired. Now, the thing about Socrates, he never charged anything, right? He was not a sophist. He was not seeking to be paid for, his 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 instruction, and really he wasn't really instructing. He was just questioning, so to speak, right? So for the Sophists, truth was a relative approach, and relative in the sense that the truth depending on a cultural or a subjective value. And instead, the truth was based on persuasive techniques. So the families valued rhetoric because rhetoric is what probably would get your children into political office. You become the great persuader. You know, you you're gonna um, um, be part of the Senate, right? You're gonna be a person of honor, of reverence, of societal um, respect, right? Now the irony was that um, uh, the Senate later basically executed Socrates because Socrates was what he was trying to do is he was trying to get to these. He was demonstrating to some of these many Senate members who he dialogued with. He would have these conversations with them in which he demonstrated their cultural essences of things like justice or what's good and bad. He was demonstrate their conclusions to be erroneous. Um, so also for Plato, the truth of the Sophists was not grounded on virtue. Virtue um, virtue is this idea of that you're obtaining the utmost excellence of something, whether it be a conception of courageousness or bravery or honesty or justice, right? And if somebody's doing something wrong by traditional means or conventional means, then it's not that Socrates, Plato would say, it's not that they're wrong. It's just they're not able to apply a good virtue or a virtue because they have no knowledge of what the good is. They have no knowledge of what's virtuous, right? So um, Socrates concluded, well, how do we become virtuous? Well, we become virtuous by inquiring, by knowing, by acquiring knowledge. Okay, so one more detail, and then we'll address Aristotle. And this detail is with regards to Plato's forms. Now, um, Plato Plato believed externally that what the senses our perceptions of what the senses gave us, that these perceptions were illusions, right? That these perceptions of the world, they did not they did not form, create, um, define an essence of the truth. So, for example, we use the self, the human self, so to speak. If one thinks of oneself, we generally regard oneself with regards to what we see in the mirror by our maybe a descriptive overview, maybe the way in which we speak, the way in which we characterize ourselves. Um, we're very sensory, societally, socially, culturally. We're very sensory. We're led by what the senses give us, by what we see, hear, touch, taste, smell, right? Well, Plato says, these are poor imitations of forms. So it can't be these sensory attributes that give us the truth. Because if you think of what the world is, it's these it's these sensory descriptors that are temporary. They're flawed. You think of the self. As we age, we wrinkle and we get ill. We eventually we're going to pass on, right? Um, well, Plato says, look, the inner spirit that even in the body decays, it's going to remain, and it's flawless. It's not temporary, and it's perfect. It's flawless. And that, in essence, gives us an essence of who you really are. Who you really are is not your the external perceptive sense of what you're viewing. It's your internal sense of being, right? Sense of the soul, sense of this inner spirit, right? Um, and that, in essence, mentally, So then, how do you nourish the soul? How do you define? How do we make sense of the world? Then, what Aristotle would then say, Plato would say, we make sense of the world because we already have everything. We already know everything. Interestingly, right? So I know what the world is because I have all these perfect forms in my mind that are able to help me correlate an understanding of what a table is, or what a computer is, or what a sculpture is. I'm able to understand everything because my inner spirit already knows it all. It's already grounded. So all I have to do is reason and idealize. And so the truth of the world, in essence, of the truth of existence is these mental forms. Right? So that's his argument. So if you think of allegory of the cave, the manner in which we're deceived or the individuals were deceived by the shadows on the wall. So it's an argument of the forms, right? In order to get to the truth, you have to get out there. You have to philosophize. You have to reason. You have to question. And he says these poets, these sophists, they all they give us are sensory, poor imitations of true forms. Okay, well that's Plato. That's Plato's argument regarding uh, his disagreement, or the foundations for which he disagrees with these poets. Now, um, it's important to know Plato because Aristotle's going to respond to that. And Aristotle, for example, beginning with Plato's forms, Aristotle said, "Look, I don't disagree with the forms necessarily, but whereas you think, Plato, that we're born with these forms already innately within us," he says, "I don't agree." He says we have to begin with an understanding. Now, it's not to say we don't know anything, but we have to begin with an understanding of the world in the sensory sense, right? He's got these causes of change and the way in which why things in the world are changing and why they're different, things of the sort. So um, I won't necessarily go into his philosophy, right? His metaphysical philosophy about forms. Aristotle's forms are certainly different from Plato's forms, but generally he tells Plato he's not right, and we do need the senses. We do need the senses, right? And it's the senses that are in essence going to give rise to our mental forms. So he does, being more specific now to literature. He does tell Plato, look, you're wrong. They're these poets. They're not sophists. Right? They're not sophists in the sense of being rhetorical. They're not trying to be persuasive. Right? They're not trying to to say, look, we're imitating this external reality in the historical sense or cultural sense or political sense. We're not doing that. Right? In essence, we're forming this artistic craft. Right? We're forming this artistic artifact, and this artistic artifact, in and of itself, in its formation, is then going to provide an imitation in the generalized sense, so that whoever reads it, right, the audience, applies a connection. Right? But that connection does not begin externally. Right? We're not being influenced in the biographical sense or historical sense or cultural sense necessarily. Right? Primarily, the craft, the work in and of itself is it's a writer sculpting or an artist sculpting his or her work, and they're forming something beautiful and aesthetic. So you are to appreciate the beauty of the story. You're to appreciate the work in and of itself. There's no, it doesn't, its intention is not a particular or direct external purpose. You know, its purpose is not to redeem Socrates' name. Its purpose is not to demonstrate the harms of psychology. Its purpose is not to, etc., 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 right? Whatever the reason, it has no purpose. The purpose is going to be formed in the crafting of the work in and of itself. And in essence, ultimately, yes, we are to have hopefully it demonstrates a connection with human nature. Obviously, we're not robots, we're not zombies, we're not going to dismissively be ignorant about whatever it is we read. We're not going to be lost in space, so to speak. So whatever it is we read, we are to take away a connection from it. But it's a connection that's not grounded externally, in the sensory sense, so to speak. So the purpose is we're reading a work or we're observing an artistic piece or we're listening to a song, and we're not to think, oh, look, this is real political. Or look, oh, this psychological attribute. Oh, look, thinking about the artist or thinking about the history. No, we're not to do that, right? We're viewing the craft, and we're not bringing in these external, issues with regards to the work. Instead, observe the work, and then it's almost like an inside out sort of concept versus outside in that Plato was kind of criticizing. So Aristotle says, look, observe the work within, and then if the work conveys its inner being to an outside connection, well, that's on the reader, that's on the viewer, that's on the listener. But the work in and of itself does not hold any of those external artifacts. Right? So the purpose is found within. Right? You're to view it aesthetically. You're not to regard a good versus bad um, um, as coming, in reference to some external essence or contextualization. Okay, I hope that makes sense, right? So there's no rhetorical purpose necessarily. And there's no direct imitation. It is a type of mimesis. Mimesis is a type of, it means imitation, right? But it's not a mimesis in the exact sense of being. It's a generalization. It's a mimetic generalization of human nature, of the world, so to speak. Okay. So how then do we understand and appreciate a work aesthetically in and of itself? Well, Aristotle's Poetics, describes a little bit more. Obviously, describes a little bit more detail. But my objective is not to describe Aristotle's Poetics. Instead, it's to regard the formalist account of literature. And Aristotle, in essence, still contributes to the matter because he does point out, rather, 6 component parts of tragedy. Right? Tragedy, you don't necessarily have to view it as a tragic account, right? It's a term to regard issues of poetry and art and drama and in the contemporary sense, song or prose and things of the sort. Well, points out these 6 components, plot, character, thought, diction, song, spectacle. In the formalist account, when we address formalism, we're going to count probably more component parts, but if you look at this essence of what Aristotle gives us, you can see how he's in essence the father of literary critique. And so he does provide great arguments for why, we should not be Platonic in our critique of a formalist piece of literature. If we take a formalist approach, we're not to criticize the piece or the artifact. or the artistic piece. We're not to criticize it in terms of, um, oh, look, it fails. It wrongly criticizes so and so. It wrongly criticizes this world attribute, or it wrongly criticizes this particular individual, right? Instead, no, observe the aesthetic beauty of the work. And we do that by, okay, let's look at the plot. Let's observe the characters, the thoughts, the thought conveyances. What's the diction? What's the verbal messages conveyed in the story? What's the song of melody? A song, so to speak. What's the spectacle? The performance that's being accounted for, right? Okay. So I hope this gives you a good historical grounding of somewhat of foundations of what that lead us to formalism. So formalism, and not just formalism, but as you see all the different sub-branches that we'll regard later on of formalism. So formalism is it's a literary critical approach, and you're going to emphasize the literary critical approach um, within the work. So the emphasis is on the work in and of itself, right? So you're not to you're we're going to strong minimize a sense of the author. We're not going to say, oh, look, this story is written with this biographical conveyance, shown here. Right? We're not going to do that, right? We're not, and also, right? We're not when we read whatever it is we're reading. The work is not to be deemed or concluded or criticized either from what the receiver concludes. It's interesting, right? So how does that happen, right? So obviously we're the ones evaluating the work, but a formalist approach, you want to, in other words, it, and I know this doesn't sound it sounds a little callous, but whatever your thoughts of the work are, they should not be relevant to a formalist critical approach. So instead, you're going to appreciate the work within itself, right? And you can be critical of the work in and of itself, but you have to be critical of the work in itself in terms of the elements of the composition. So the privileging of the text is going to be with regards to the design of the text above everything else. So we are going to consider, we're going to emphasize, and we're going to heighten plot, characterization, irony, ambiguity, use of figurative language, syntax, right? So we're going to account for all these literary devices, right? Syntax being word structure, diction being word choice, figurative language being metaphors and similes, um, irony, right? The unexpected is happening, right? Um, and so this is the formalist approach, right? So it is an aspect of content or meaning, and it's generally regarded that form is separate from content or meaning. So, if you observe an artistic piece, right? If you observe an artistic piece, whether it be you know, a canvas, illustrated with colors from a palette, or a prose novel, or a short story or a poem. Um, we can, in the conventional sense, will regard different forms, right? And but then the meaning will separate the meaning from the form. So whatever it is we're observing, we might detail the meaning as separate from that particular form. Well, not here. Form and content are inseparable, right? You're not to separate them. So the meaning is, in essence, it's impacted by the form, right? So we're not going to consider, again, the biographical, or we're not going to address issues of psychology, sociology, history, or cultural references, so to speak. We're not going to address issues of economics, or the social sphere, political issues. We're not going to address the warlike circumstances today, or issues of peace. None of that, right? Um, why? Because we're that would what's the reason for that? Well, one idea is that the work then becomes an issue of, and the work is no longer valued within itself. The aesthetic beauty of the work is no longer regarded within itself. So it's like when we go to a museum and we see a beautiful. Let's take something simple, like, it's not simple, of course, right? But we take something like the Mona Lisa, and can that still be regarded? Can even though Da Vinci's not alive anymore, can that still be criticized uh, differently? Well, yeah, somebody can say, well, oh, that's a safe self portrait of Da Vinci via as a woman, or as an apparent woman, right? A formalist would say, formalist critical approach would say, no, let's observe the beauty, the use of the colors, the angles, you know, the flow of the organic flow of the shades, and what is it that's surfacing? If we look at a sculpture of Michelangelo's David, you know, many would say, oh, it's a false representation of the biblical David, right? And formalists would say, no, observe the polishing of the marble, observe the curvature of the angles, the use of symmetry, right? Of This may be possible descriptors, and I'm not sure of how strongly he's described in the Bible, so to speak, but um, formalists would say, no, it's irrelevant. That's not relevant to our appreciation of the artistic artifact, right? Um, it's not. So it's, in essence, it's almost like the artistic piece is to be timeless. There's no sense of time, the time aspect in a formalist critical approach. Okay. Okay, I hope this grounds you well. I hope this gives you a good understanding of formalism, right? So one of the sub branches, new criticism, which uh, very much in line with the descriptors I provided, or not that I provided, but the descriptors that conventional theory and scholars have provided. Um, New criticism identically minimizes the role of both the source and the receiver. In other words, it doesn't matter what the author's thoughts are, it doesn't matter what the receiver's thoughts are. What are we going to do? Instead, we're going to appreciate the work by the use of the craft. And yes, an author did craft the piece. We're not going to take that away from him, but we're going to give him credit for the craft. We're not going to give him credit for who he is, his biography, or his thoughts, or ideas. Instead, we're going to admire him for the craft, so to speak, right? And the intrinsic qualities that are found and grounded within the use of the literary work. So, so again, emphasizing this, and I realize it's slightly repetitive, but the emphasis again is we're going to account for the work in of itself, right? The work in and of itself, and whatever formation comes about, the craft which leads to formation, that's what's going to give us the message, and the medium, whether it be a novel, whether it be a sculpture, whether it be an artistic piece. Now, regards to this class, of course, it's the medium is prose or poetry, but um, that's what's to give us the message. It's not the text itself. I mean, it's not the any external influences that are given the message. It's the text itself that's given the message. Okay, so considering a new critical approach, we can observe some of these components, and of course, we observe the Aristotelian components of tragedy, and those are still evident here. But consider issues like irony, style, theme, imagery, ambiguity, diction, right? Figurative language, issues of irony is slightly figurative, but issues of metaphor and simile, symbolism. The word in which the way in which an author lines his ideas, right? The order of the ideas. How is it being? What's the how do we get, for example, in a narrative? How do we get to the climactic approach, right? Got a sense of rising action, falling action. So all these elements, right? The way in which the craftfulness, the organic craftfulness of the work, how does it provide a how do they relate to one another? How do they relate? Not only how do they relate to one another, how do they relate to one another, and how does that relation create the whole? And so that as one observes this form, and it delivers a particular message, whatever that message might be, these are universal. It's not specific. And even more so, they're not only are they um, necessarily not specific, but whatever that there's also no one universal theme. There's many possible universal themes, many possible relations that can give a sense of human nature. Right. All right. Now, some critiques of formalism, the formalist critical approach, is that it dismisses the importance of critical studies, right? Like feminist criticism, or as we'll see, in future presentations, when we get to issues of structuralism, that there's a disregard of theoretical approaches or the use of language, issues of political theory, um, critical race theory, right? So why is the formalist critical approach is disregarding issues of like feminism or racism or immigration, things like that. And they're undoubtedly important. They're undoubtedly important. But I also think there's a beauty, and of course for those we would use different critical approaches, right? We wouldn't apply a formalist critical approach, but I think there is a beauty in appreciating the craft of a work in and of itself. So I hope that's helped. I hope this helps you. I hope this helps you understand, in essence, formalist critical approach. So okay, so now I'd like to provide an example. So I'd like to provide an example of Edgar Allan Poe's, and a lot of individuals regard this as one of his the perfect uh, short story, at least Edgar Allan Poe's most perfect short story. Um, it's arguable, of course, because my goodness gracious, he's written many other stories that are um, gothically fantastic, right? um, so, but let's observe Cask of Amontillado, which is a really interesting piece. And now consider that as we're about to engage in Poe's Cask of Amontillado, consider that a lot of individuals would maybe address a biographical account of a Cask of Amontillado, and that might be true, Right? It might be, Poe's. It's noted that Poe in a sense wrote this piece to reply to an individual who was critical of Poe, and that there was a type of rivalry between them. But instead, we're not. So you'll see as we go, and I'm not going to go into all the elements of the story, but I'm going to address one particular element. As you observe that one particular element, you'll see how what is it that I'm doing? I'm focusing on just the one element and how that one element is a component of the story and how that one element is crafting the formation of the story, rather than saying, "Oh, look, Poe's biographical background. That's why he wrote this way, or why that's why he wrote this that way." Right? We're not. That might be possible, but we're not. We're not doing that. We're not going to do that with this particular literary piece. So let's observe. So um, the story. The story. A quick summary regards to key characters. And those are the names of Montresor and Fortunato. And the story goes, and there's no specific detailing of what happened, but Montresor's relatively upset. He's considerably upset that Fortunato is generally got him in trouble, and see, it seems like you know, he, he underwent a series of injuries, right? Maybe he was imprisoned and got out and seeking to apply a type of revenge, so to speak. Um, so Montresor is very upset with Fortunato, who who says, this Fortunato insulted me, and so I'm going to acquire revenge. And so um, he goes and he plays this befriending aspect onto Fortunato, only to later deceive him himself, um, get him severely inebriated, and ultimately chain him up in a hole in the wall in the catacombs of the catacombs underneath the town, and plaster the wall up and cover the wall up as if so that nobody would discover him. and so the story ends. Poor Fortunato winds up being buried alive, so to speak. It's a very quick overview of the story. It's a little bit. The story is much more rich and complex than that. But the one element I want to point out in accounting for the formalist approach is irony. So let me read these lines here from the text, and you'll observe how the use of irony is crafting and forming these lines. Right? It's not any external issues of culture or history or more particularly biographical sense, but it's the craft itself that's forming these pieces. So it says, "The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. I said to him, 'My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today.'" Um, so let's think of irony a little bit. Irony is the unexpected surfaces, right? So Fortunato, the name, it has a slight, maybe Italian, maybe Spanish ring to it, which means fortunate. Means fortunate, and so it's acknowledged here, right? It's not acknowledged initially. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, right? So it's here's Montresor saying, "Look, this guy injured me severely," but then there's a parallel of the fortunate nature of Fortunato, right? It says, "My dear Fortunato, you're luckily met," and it's Montresor saying, "Look, we're lucky to have met." The irony there is that this fortunate one is anything but lucky to have met Montresor. Why is that? Well, because as we know, Montresor's, as you read the text, you realize that Montresor's is very clever, very creepy, very, you know, um, demonic. I'm losing my words here, right? Type of individual, and the way in which he crafts his revenge. I mean, it's it's quite very scary, right? So, what results to poor Fortunato? The irony is, you read there, it says, a succession of loud and shrill screams bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form seemed to thrust me violently back. There's Montresor saying, this is the way he's reacting after he's chained him up and he's about to bury him alive. So poor Fortunato ironically, is anything but fortunate. Also, the irony of the setting, right? We can probably marry setting and irony a little bit here, where is it that he meets Fortunato? Well, he meets him at a carnival. It was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season that I encountered my friend. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. So you get this image of the carnival, and he's dressed in this motley appearance of jester-like hat with the cones popping out, the little bells at the end. So very jovial, very party-like, right? But this is the irony, is that this is contrasted. The setting of carnivals contrasted with the catacombs. It reads, I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent and stood together upon the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. We had passed through the long walls of piled skeletons, with casks and pumpkins intermingling into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. So you see there's an ironic contrast of this, right? That they meet in a jovial stance carnival, but it ends severely, in death and in the catacombs of all places, right? I don't want to say justifyingly in the catacombs, but of course, the catacombs is where generally you find death. Also, the irony of the reference to wine, right? So you can think a little bit of diction, the author's use of, because maybe it could have been some other substance, but cleverly it's wine, and it seems to be, it creates an organic touch to the writing of Poe's story, and the irony here is one of Fortunato's knowledge of wine, right? He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. So here's Fortunato drinking jovially, drinking wine. He's warm inside, and it's making him feel happy. And the continuous use of wine, right? Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mold. He raised it to his lips with a leer, right? Here's Fortunato continuously drinking, and so when we think of drinking wine, there's this idea of drinking for happiness' sake, for celebration, right? What one idea, right? There's also the negative note of drinking, but in this sense, the carnival, there's drinking involved. They're Fortunato feels he's drinking for the sake of joviality, of happiness, right? And he says, I drink, he said, to the buried that repose around us. I'm drinking in honor to the dead. You can't get more ironic than that. In a little bit, you're basically drinking to yourself, right? He paused and nodded to me familiarly while his bells jingled. Again, there's that jovial intonation. I broked and reached him a flagon de Grave. He emptied it at breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. So here's Fortunato. He's playing the part, right? He's drinking. I drink to the dead, and look at me. I'm the gesticulations he's doing. He's doing this form of the kind of representation of the group of Masons that supposedly Montresor belonged to. Are you part of the Masons? They did this little dance of sorts, or what have you. So there's the irony. He's drinking instead of drinking celebration and issues. He's drinking um, um, onto his death, and not only is he drinking to honor the dead as well. He's drank to honor his own death. Not directly, of course, but see the irony, right? The irony of which wine is being used. And finally, there's the irony of nobility versus I figured this contrast, the ironic contrast of nobility and savagery. So Montresor, the whole play, he talks about his noble status, that he comes from a wealthy family, and group of this well-known group of Masons and things of the sort, and see, and yet reveals this savage individual, right? Savage individual who's basically buried this gentleman alive, right? But to these words I hearkened in vain, for after he's buried him, he says, but to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called out loud, Fortunato! No answer. I called again, Fortunato! No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick. It was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up against the new masonry. I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In paz requiescat. And may rest in peace. So you see the irony here of Montresor, a fine gentleman of respected reverence, yet the severe ironic intonation of his savage demonic capabilities. Right? So again, acknowledging the formalist account, you note that you see how the craft of irony, the element of irony, and not any external, not biographical, not psychological, not social, not cultural, right? None of that, or not political, none of that is influencing the beauty of Poe's text here. Well, I hope this has informed you properly, right? It's not necessarily necessarily an easy critical approach to understand, but I hope the foundational attributes and mention of the formalist theory and the example of Poe have all provided you with an understanding of the formalist critical approach. So I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.